Thanks for sharing those things, by the way. I know it's not easy to get up and talk when you don't want to, especially in front of other people that you may not know. And so thank you. It was really a blessing to me to hear that, so I appreciate that. Thank you. One of the things that I get to do more often than I would like as a pastor is I get to go to the cemetery. I've had the honor, I consider it a great honor to do funerals, actually. And so I've had the honor of doing funerals for a lot of people that you care about. But when I go to cemeteries, it shapes, being a pastor shapes the way you see funerals and cemeteries a little bit differently than a lot of regular other jobs, I guess. There's a level of familiarity that comes with it that you may not have. And so when funerals happen, a lot of times I like to just spend time in the cemetery and looking at the headstones. I know people don't like to spend a lot of time in cemeteries, but I always just find it interesting to go around and look at all the headstones and just see, when people have died. I try and find who the oldest person is or whatever. And there's often like little interesting sayings or pictures on like some beautiful artwork on headstones that kind of reflect a little bit of who that person was in life and something that captures their essence, so to speak. And that's been going on for a long time. Just to give you a couple examples, you probably don't recognize this name, Rudolf van Seulen, but you will recognize what he discovered, which is the number pi. And so he has literally pi printed on his headstone as his epitaph. Did anyone ever have one of those competitions where you could memorize the amount of pi? Like, how far could you get? I can only ever get to 3.14. Has anyone ever gotten beyond that? Like, what's 6 digits beyond? Has anyone gotten 6 digits beyond pi? Yeah. Could you do it now, Peter, if we asked you? Oh, I know. If we took that off the screen or whatever, I know. That'd be a fun little party game. Like we could, anyway, whatever. I'm on. Another one is from Martin Luther King Jr. on his headstone. It says, free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last, from one of his famous speeches. Epitaphs kind of give you this picture of what that person was like and what they valued and what was important to them. And so this morning, I want to talk about the cross because the cross serves as the ultimate epitaph for what Jesus came to accomplish. Max Lucado, in his book called The Cross, says this. It's a lengthy quote, but I think it's worth reading. It says this: it rests on the timeline of history like a compelling diamond. Its tragedy summons all sufferers. Its absurdity attracts all cynics. Its hope lures all searchers. History has idolized and despised it, gold-plated and burned it, worn and trashed it. History has done everything but ignore it. How could you ignore such a piece of lumber? Suspended on its beams is the greatest claim in history. A crucified carpenter claiming to be God on earth, divine, eternal, the death slayer. Never has timber been regarded so sacred. No wonder the Apostle Paul called the cross event the core of the gospel. Its bottom line sobering. If the account is true, it's history's hinge, period. If not, the cross is history's hoax. I love that line. Is the cross a hinge or a hoax for you? What is the position of the cross in your life? I think that's an important question that every single one of us has to wrestle with at some point in time or another. The cross is not something that you can just ignore. Eventually, you will come to a point where you have to decide what is the cross to you. Because it is central. It is central to history. It is central to who we are as followers of Jesus. And so I just want to spend a little bit of time this morning talking about what does a life centered around the cross look like? What does that look like in our everyday lives? If it's such a big deal, if it's so important to us who claim to be followers of Jesus, what should that look like in our lives? Because I think that's an important question we need to ask. And so we're going to keep going with our series in Corinthians. We're going to pick up in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18. I'm going to read through to the end of the chapter, and Paul will give us some helpful things to answer that question. All right, here we go. You ready? Oh, we're not ready. Are we ready? All right, okay. All right, let's go. Let's go. All right. The message of the cross is foolish to those who are headed for destruction, but we who are being saved know it is the very power of God. As the scriptures say, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and discard the intelligence of the intelligent. So where does this leave the philosophers, the scholars, and the world's brilliant debaters? God has made the wisdom of this world look foolish, since God in his wisdom saw to it that the world would never know him through human wisdom. He has used our foolish preaching to save those who believe. It is foolish to the Jews who ask for signs from heaven. It is foolish to the Greeks who seek human wisdom. So when we preach that Christ was crucified, the Jews are offended and the Gentiles say it's all nonsense. But to those called by God to salvation, both Jews and Gentiles, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. This foolish plan of God is wiser than the wisest of human plans, and God's weakness is stronger than the greatest of human strength. Remember, dear brothers and sisters, that few of you were wise in the world's eyes or powerful or wealthy when God called you. Instead, God chose things that the world considers foolish in order to shame those who think they are wise. And he chose things that are powerless to shame those who are powerful. God chose things despised by the world, things counted as nothing at all, and used them to bring to nothing what the world considers important. As a result, no one can ever boast in the presence of God. God has united you with Christ Jesus. For our benefit, God made him to be wisdom itself. Christ made us right with God. He made us pure and holy, and he freed us from sin. Therefore, as the scriptures say, if you want to boast, boast only about the Lord. And just before we get into that, I just got bifocals, and I'm like, the world is different now. Like, I'm reading that passage, I'm like, whoa, okay. That was awesome. Okay. Amazing. The first thing that we need to see if we're going to have a life that's centered around the cross and Jesus is that we need to understand that the cross goes front and center even though it divides. Front and center, even though it divides. Now, previously, if you were here, we talked about divisions, and that's what Paul's really talking about in this first chapter. He's dealing with these people who have created the divisions in the church based on personality and preference, right? Do you remember that? They were saying, hey, listen, I'm on team Paul, I'm on team Apollos, I'm team Peter, and the guys are like, I'm team Jesus, right? And so they try and create these divisions based on personality, and those were unhealthy divisions. But there are times and topics and situations where there are healthy divisions, where there's a line drawn in the sand and you need to choose a side. An issue is so important that you can't just not be on a side. You have to be able to pick and land on something. And so there have been a couple silly examples of this in our culture that you will recognize where people definitely landed on one side or the other. The first one is from 2015. And do you remember the what color is the dress thing? Do you remember that? So for those of you who don't know this, in 2015, this picture of this dress, this is the original picture, came out and people were asking, what color is this dress? Now for me, this is so obviously blue and black. But what happened was people say, that's not blue and black, that's gold and white. And so there was this huge division, whether you saw the dress as blue and black or gold and white. Now, how many of you, I'm curious, would see this dress as gold and white? What? Wow, that's amazing. How many would see this as blue and black? Yeah. You guys need to borrow some of my glasses. Like, these are world changers. Yeah, that's amazing. So and there have been studies done on whether or not this dress is like why people's brains will see gold and white and some will see blue and black. And it's just kind of one of those really interesting things. Another divisive topic that is again silly but is also a source of heated debate is whether or not a hot dog is a sandwich. So is a hot dog a sandwich, or is it something different? Now, this is from the National Hot Dog and Sausage Council, which I find just hilarious that they have this. But the number I want you to see is that 57%. So that's about half and half, right? Would say, no, it's not a sandwich. A hot dog is a sandwich. Now, how many would you say a hot dog is a sandwich? How many would argue that? I'm on team sandwich on this one. It means, who's on hot dog's not a sandwich? Most of you are like, if a hot dog is not a sandwich, like what is a sandwich? Anyway, all right, we won't get into it. We don't have time. All right. A final one that I found really interesting and kind of funny, and I asked this at home this week, was whether or not it's better to fight a horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses. All right, so whether or not you fight one horse-sized duck, a duck the size of a horse, or whether you fight 100 duck-sized horses. Now, my family landed on 100 duck-sized horses because they figured you could probably just kick them. Most of them, you could just boot them out of the way. But then I said, well, they bite and they're fast. Can you imagine how fast a duck-sized horse would go? You'd never be able to hit it. It would bite you, run away, kick you, all that sort of stuff. Anyway, it's a huge debate. I don't know where you land and what it says about you if what side you choose. But what this does, as a funny example, is really it just shows you how two people or a group of people can look at the exact same thing and come to very different answers, come to very different conclusions. That's what Paul is saying in verse 18. The message of the cross is foolish to those who are headed for destruction, but we who are being saved know it is the very power of God. So people will see the same cross and they'll say, yes, that's stupid, that's foolish, or no, this is what my salvation is rooted in. So how do you view it? How do you view it? Paul was really clear how he saw it. And just the next chapter over, and we'll look at this later on, in 1 Corinthians 2, verse 2, Paul writes, "For I have decided that while I was with you, I would forget everything except Jesus Christ, the one who was crucified." He would forget everything else. The cross and Jesus crucified was the most important thing. At the end of the book, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 and 4, he says, "I passed on to you what was most important and what has been passed on to me. Christ died for our sins, just as the scriptures said. He was buried and he was raised from the dead on the third day, just as the scriptures had said." This was the most important thing for him. That first importance is even captured in our language, the language that we use. So the word crux, for example, is the Latin word for cross. And you've ever heard the saying, the crux of the matter is this, right? That is saying that this point that I'm making is the substantial claim. It is the piece that holds up the rest of my argument. It is the most important thing. Without it, it all falls apart. The same is true of the cross. The word crucial is from the same Latin root word as crux. And it's crucial to entertain this idea of what the cross is all about. When we say something is crucial, we're saying that it is central to what we're saying. Without it, there is no argument. But even just look at some of the images. I don't know if you would recognize this. Maybe if you've gone to coffee shops or whatever, you will see oftentimes a lotus flower. Maybe if you do yoga, you'll see this in the studio. A lotus flower is the symbol for Buddhism, which represents, a cycle of life and death, and it's also beauty in the midst of that. And so you'll see this image that represents something important. There's also the hammer and the sickle from communism, which indicated this cooperation between the peasants and the industrialists to create one common motherland. And if you think about Christianity could have chosen a lot of different symbols to represent the faith. I mean, you could have used, for example, a manger to represent, God coming to earth that we celebrate at Christmas time. You could use a dove, the Holy Spirit, peace coming through Jesus. You could use a throne to represent, God as the King of Kings and Jesus establishing his kingdom here on earth. You could use the empty tomb, maybe like a rock rolled away or something like that to indicate, that the resurrected Jesus. But it's the cross that people picked. It's the cross that is the lasting image of our faith, because there is no good news without the cross. Without the death of Jesus, there is no good news. And so the cross is central. I mentioned my glasses, and I had to go to the eye doctor. When you're sitting in the chair, what are the first thing they pull up, right? Is this big eye chart, right? The cross is the big E on the eye chart. If you can't see the big E, you got like big problems, right? Like you can't see anything else. If you can't see the big E, you're going to miss everything else. The same is true of the cross. The cross is the big E. If you can't see the cross, if you don't understand what the cross means for us, then you're missing everything else. It's so important. It's so central. But despite its centrality, it's at odds with the world around us. It's at odds with the culture that we live in. Paul had the same problem. Let's read verse 20 to 23 again. So where does this leave the philosophers, the scholars, and the world's brilliant debaters? God has made the wisdom of this world look foolish. Since God in his wisdom saw to it that the world would never know him through human wisdom, he has used our foolish preaching to save those who believe. It is foolish to the Jews who ask for signs from heaven, and it is foolish to the Greeks who seek human wisdom. And so when we preach that Christ was crucified, the Jews are offended, and the Gentiles say it's all nonsense. So Paul is addressing the two major cultures that are in Corinth, that are involved with the church, the Gentiles and the Jews. And he's saying, listen, both of these people groups are having troubles with the cross. They're stumbling blocks. They're tripping up on it, but for different reasons. For different reasons. He says the Jews are offended by it. And it's interesting, if you look through the New Testament, when it talks about the crucifixion of Jesus, it has one word that is used very often. In Acts chapter 5, let me just rip off a couple examples here for you. Acts chapter 5, verse 30, the God of our ancestors raised Jesus from the dead after you killed him by hanging on a cross. The word cross in that translation is literally the word tree. You killed him on a tree. Some of you will have that version. Acts chapter 10, verse 39, and we apostles are witness of all he did throughout Judea and Jerusalem. They put him to death by hanging him on a tree. Galatians chapter 3, verse 13, Paul writes, but Christ has rescued us from the curse pronounced by the law. When he was hung on the cross, he took upon himself the curse for our wrongdoing. For it is written in the scriptures, cursed is everyone who is hung on a tree. What's with the tree language? What's that talking about? Is it just kind of artistic language? Like trees and crosses are both made of wood. They're both upright. Like, is it just kind of that poetic kind of language, or is there something more to it? The answer is there is something more to it. And Paul quotes the passage that points everything in the right direction. The reason the Jews are so offended by the cross. In Deuteronomy chapter 21, it says, if someone has committed a crime worthy of death and is executed and hung on a tree, the body must not remain hanging from the tree overnight. You must bury the body that same day. For anyone who is hung is cursed in the sight of God. So anyone who's hung on a tree is cursed in the sight of God. And I know crucifixion is a little bit different than being hung on a tree, but you see the comparisons, and what the New Testament writers are trying to point to is the fact that the agony of the cross, although the physical agony was excruciating and awful, the real agony for Jesus was the curse that Jesus took upon himself for our sake. The abandoning of God so that we might be able to be in the presence of God. And that was just too much for the Jewish people to hear. their expectation, their picture of a Messiah was not one who was going to be cursed by God, but that was going to be elevated and promoted and lifted up by God to lead the people of Israel out. And to be able to say that their Messiah died and was cursed in that death by God just did not match up with them. And to say that that was the Messiah was offensive to them. But then he also talks about the Gentiles and the Greeks. And the word he uses is nonsense, which is a euphemism for crazy, for literally crazy. Why would anyone worship a crucified God? They just couldn't get their heads around it. In fact, they made fun of people who did. This is one of the earliest images of the crucifixion, which is actually a piece of graffiti written on a house in Italy. And you can see the crucifixion. There's the body of Jesus, but it's got the head of a donkey. And there's an inscription underneath of it which says, let me just make sure I get it right. Aleximanos worships his God, is what it says in the inscription. They just thought it was silly, foolish, ridiculous, stupid. Paul writes in verse 25, this foolish plan of God is wiser than the wisest of human plans, and God's weakness is stronger than the greatest of human strengths. It's foolish because you have to admit that you don't have it all together to follow Jesus. You have to admit that you aren't perfect. And for some of us, that's not going to work. For some of us, we have such a struggle because in our hearts, we believe that we're good people, right? Let's look at our community. Our community embodies this in so many ways. We pay our taxes. We provide for our families. We send our kids to hockey. We love our kids. We tell the truth most of the time. We even recycle, right? We're good people. But if the standard is perfection, we all fall short of that standard. And the message of the cross isn't try harder, do better, get more education, but is let Jesus be your substitute. And for some of us, we just can't get our heads around that. If I just try harder, even those of us who call Jesus Lord still fall into that rut of saying, I just need to try harder, I just need to read more, I just need to pray more. And Jesus' response to that is not about trying harder, this is about allowing me to move in your life. Theologian Michael Horton writes, what distinguishes Christianity at its heart is not its moral code, but its story. And the story is this: the creator of the universe stooped down to reconcile the very creation who rejected him by sending his son to die in our place. That's the story. That's the story we retell ourselves every time we have communion. It's the story that we remind ourselves. And life centered on the cross has the cross at the forefront, even though it's divisive. And also, it means that we elevate Jesus, not ourselves. The second point is that we elevate Jesus, not ourselves. Picking up verse 26. Remember, dear brothers and sisters, that few of you were wise in the world's eyes or powerful or wealthy when God called you. Instead, God chose things that the world considers foolish in order to shame those who think they are wise. And he chose things that are powerless to shame those who are powerful. God chose things despised by the world, things counted as nothing at all, and used them to bring to nothing what the world considers important. As a result, no one can ever boast in the presence of God. I know this is hard to believe, seeing me the way I am now, but when I was a little kid, I was a little chunky. I was probably the same weight I am now, but like 4 feet tall. And so when I was attending Vincent Massey Elementary School, soccer baseball was the big deal. Like every kid played soccer baseball. Gym class, it was soccer baseball. And gym teachers back then, dare I say the 90s, early 90s, no, mid 90s, were not quite as sensitive to the chunky kids as they are now. And you know how this works. You know how the teams were made in soccer baseball, don't you? You pick two kids, usually the loudest, usually the ones who had the most eagerness. Two kids were picked to be team captains. And you know how the selection went. You've been there. They first would pick the strongest and the most athletic kids. Boys, actually. We're a patriarchal society when I was in school. So the strongest boys would always get picked first. And then it would be the strongest girls. Although they couldn't kick as far, they were quick and could get around the bases really fast. And so the strongest girls were then picked. And it moved down the line until you got to the end where the chubby kids were, who couldn't quite kick the ball. Like when I was in elementary school, I struck out in t-ball and I never played t-ball again, right? That's my coordination level. So being picked in soccer baseball beyond the 12th pick, if it was a draft, I'm like Mr. Irrelevant, the last pick. Okay? I'm just unloading my childhood trauma on you right now. And so you knew how it worked. It would work in that descending order, and then the fat kids got to play kickball at the end of the game because we were always the last one who got to go up. And if you were building something today, if you were building an organization, or if you're trying to grow a business or something like that, from a worldly perspective, we still follow the same rules, right? We pick the best and the brightest. We pick the most dedicated and committed. The ones who are a little off, the ones who are a little uncoordinated, the ones who are not demonstrating full capacity, those are the ones that kind of get pushed to the end. What's interesting is that is not how God builds his church. He flips that upside down. And that's why you have me as a pastor. Right? He says, listen, I don't care if you're chubby. I don't care if you got rolls. I don't care if you're slow. I don't care if you're weak. I don't care if you can't talk. I don't care about any of those things. I don't care if you're uncoordinated. I don't care if you easily get distracted. Are you focused on Jesus? That's the criteria. Are you focused on Jesus? And that's something that God can work with. And Paul says, listen, I had foolish preaching, but God was able to use that to build his church. And what the Corinthians are doing is they're letting this kind of worldly mindset creep in where they begin to start name dropping to kind of get a little bit a higher level on a social standing, a little higher social footing. And they say, if I follow Paul, that might give me a little bit more worth. It might give me a little bit more, I'm on Team Paul. That gives me a sense of identity now, and I'm able to kind of feel a little bit more confident, elevates me a little bit more. And so there's this kind of social climbing that's happening within the church, something that's kind of similar to how we live in our culture now, where if you don't have the best intellect, the best influence, or the most wealth, you don't really get a seat at the table. That's what it was like in Corinth. That's kind of how it works now. You need to have one of those three: intellect, influence, or pedigree. And Paul says, don't let that creep into the church. Don't let that be the way in which you organize yourselves. Remember who you were before. Because there were not many of you that had those three things. He says, remember who you were before. And don't let that shape you. Now I'm going to finish off with this ridiculous illustration, but it works well. How many of you have ever heard of Spanx? Does anyone know what I mean when I say Spanx? So, oh man, this is wild. Spanx is like this company that creates the modern day girdle, is kind of how I would describe it. Like, as a boy, I'm not privy to all these things, but basically it's this compression kind of I don't even know how to describe it. It's like undergarment, that's the right word. Compression undergarment, right? That kind of tucks in the things that need to get tucked, accentuates the things that need to be accentuated, and kind of gives this different picture of who you are, right? And good news, guys, there is boy Spanx now. I've got one on order. But what happens? You walk out, you're wearing your Spanx, you're like, I'm looking good, right? Everything's tight where it should be, and anyway, I won't stop there. My filter kicked in. I was like, yes, filter. But what happens is you get home and you peel the Spanx off, and everything just goes back to where it was before, right? Like everything is back where you don't want it to be. In a way, but not in a Spanx kind of way, but in a very kind of real way, Paul is saying, do not allow those temporary things to shape you into who you are supposed to be. Do not allow the Spanx of culture to shape who you are as a follower of Jesus. The Spanx of wealth or your pedigree or your influence. But allow the nature of Jesus Christ to shape you, and the cross to be the one thing that you rally your life around. It is the one thing that identifies you as a follower of Jesus. And he says, listen, if you're going to boast about something, boast about Jesus and what he accomplished on the cross for you, not about where you came from, not about how much money's in your bank account, or not about how much influence you have. It reminds me of this passage, and I'll wrap up with this. Acts chapter 4, verse 13. I love this passage, and I need to be reminded of it all the time. When describing Peter and John in front of the Sanhedrin, they were called in front of this religious group because they were talking about Jesus. They were kind of getting their wrists slapped. It says this about them. The members of the council were amazed when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, for they could see that they were ordinary men with no special training in the scriptures. They also recognized them as men who had been with Jesus. Are people able to look at your life and say that you have been with Jesus? Has the good news of the cross penetrated your heart in such a way that it bleeds out into everyday life? We're too polite in the Maritimes to brag about things, right? We don't brag about anything really, but we do elevate things. We're really good at that. We do elevate things that we think are important. And so my question as we wrap up is, what are you elevating? Are there things that you are putting higher than Jesus? If you're not a follower of Jesus, is Jesus in the conversation with what you're elevating? We're going to finish with this song. I'm going to pull a page from Jeremy's book and have a song as we finish from the 1900s. How deep the Father's love for us. I just love this one. There's a line in it that I think really ties up well with what we're talking about and finishing up with. It's a line that says, I will not boast in anything, no gifts, no power, no wisdom, but I will boast in Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection. And so a life centered around the cross puts the cross central, even though we know it divides, and allows us to elevate Jesus ahead of ourselves. Let's sing.
Why don't we stand together and sing? How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that he should give his only Son, to glory. Behold the man upon the cross, the sin upon his shoulder. Ashamed, I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. It was my sin that held him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me back. I know that it is finished. I will not boast in anything, no gifts, no power, no wisdom, but I will boast in Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection. Why should I gain from his reward? I cannot give an answer, but this I know with all my heart: his wounds have paid my ransom. Father, I just pray that this week we would just boast about nothing but you and the cross. We'd just be mindful of the significance of it in our life, that we would keep it central in our life, that it would define who we are, and that it would influence the things that we do and say this week. And help us to help each other with that. Help us to be encouragers